Hello, this is Michelle Miller, and I am providing some lecture material for Global Ecology and Conservation Biology. And in the previous lecture, we were talking about the carbon cycle. And this is an example of a biogeochemical cycle. So if you break that down, bio means life, geo means earth, and then we have chemical. Right? So we're talking about carbon cycle as an example of a biogeochemical cycle. So if we look at the flows as a review of how carbon flows in this cycle, one way that it flows is through photosynthesis. And so we learned previously that plants are capable of photosynthesis. So they capture atmospheric carbon dioxide. So CO2 from the atmosphere gets taken into plant material, or made into plant material. Okay, so that is actually a sink. So one problem is that with this flow is that we have increased deforestation. So deforestation in terms of decreasing the amount of plants that are able to store carbon in their tissues, but also oftentimes when we talk about the rainforest undergoes deforestation when the trees are cut and then they're burnt. And so that releases carbon into the atmosphere. So this is a problem, a human caused problem with this biogeochemical cycle. We also have respiration. And so plants also undergo respiration, and microbes do, and humans do, and all animals do. So what this is this releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. So when I breathe out carbon dioxide. If we look at some other flows, we talked about fossil fuels, and fossil fuels being ancient plants, some animals, and when they get covered up and great pressure is exerted on them and heated up, then they turn that plant material turns into fossil fuels. So another problem with this is with fossil fuels, we release stored carbon into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is a potent greenhouse gas. And so it is believed to be causing some of the climate change that we are currently seeing. The other thing about the flow of carbon is that carbon gets dissolved in water. So carbon dioxide, I keep messing that up. Carbon dioxide gets dissolved in water. So we can talk about oceans. So oceans take up CO2. So it just gets dissolved in the ocean. And the problem with oceans taking up CO2 is that when you mix carbon dioxide with water, it produces an acid. So CO2 plus H2O produces H2CO3, and this is carbonic acid. So this is causing ocean acidification, and this is a problem that is actually linked to carbon, but it is different than global warming. And so the CO2 that is being dissolved, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, so there's more CO2 being dissolved by the oceans, and so the oceans are becoming more acidic. And the biggest problem with this is that this specifically dissolves shells of organisms in the ocean. So we're already seeing on the coast of Oregon oyster farms that are having problems forming oysters because the Pacific Ocean has become too acidic. Okay, and then we also have sedimentation. So that's a flow. And this is when carbon gets incorporated into sediments and it forms rocks that you might be familiar with, like limestone but also some stuff you might put in your house like marble, right? And this is calcium carbonate. So this is calcium carbonate. So organisms can take in calcium and they can use it to build their shell if it's not too acidic, right? And then that can become buried after the organism dies. And so we have storage of carbon in certain sediments. Okay, so if we look at this is kind of interesting. This shows the idea of photosynthesis. And so this is from a station in Hawaii that looks at the parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And you'll see that it has an annual cycle. So this would be like summer, or actually spring, right? Where lots of plants grow, in this particular instance, lots of plants grow. And then this would be fall, where lots of plants die. And so it seems to have a, in the spring, when plants start to grow, carbon will start to be taken out of the atmosphere, and then in the summer it gets taken out. And then in the fall, when plants stop growing, then we get an increase in carbon. So we see this annual cycle of carbon, but you'll notice that the trend is upward. And the vast majority of scientists on the planet believe that this is a human-caused trend rather than caused by other factors outside of human activity. So if we look at the difference in pH, we see that the most acidic areas here would be in the orange and the yellow. And so this would be a great problem, say, for example, on coral reefs, right? So we have acidification of the water in those areas. So ocean pH is related to CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Okay, so we are going to talk about some other elements. So the other elements that we're going to refer to are nitrogen and phosphate and sulfur. So those are all common elements that we see in living things. So the one thing that's really interesting about the nitrogen cycle is that nitrogen is super abundant in our atmosphere. So if we look at N2, which is nitrogen gas, it actually makes 78% of our atmosphere. So that means that a lot of the nitrogen on our planet is stored in the atmosphere. But it's stored in a form that is really hard to get. And so if I were to draw the molecular formula here, there's 3 bonds that hold these nitrogens together. And so most organisms do not have the ability to break that bond. And so when we talk about nitrogen fixation, this is the removal of nitrogen from the atmosphere and the incorporation into an inorganic form that can be used by plants. And the incorporation into an inorganic, which means that there's not carbon molecules, form that can be used by plants. This takes energy. And so, for example, NH3 is something that can be used by plants, and this is called ammonia. And it is a type of nitrogenous waste that it can be used if it's in the soil, it can be actually taken up. So we talked about limiting nutrients, and nitrogen is oftentimes a limiting nutrient for plant growth. And so we can add nitrogen to the soil, and that will help increase it. But one of the interesting things about nitrogen fixation is that it cannot be done by plants alone. And so it has to be done by microorganisms that have the proper enzymes to convert this form of nitrogen into this form of nitrogen. And so we can talk about nitrogen fixing bacteria. and plants. So there's nitrogen-fixing bacteria in water, like in the ocean, cyanobacteria, and there's also nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in the roots of plants. And when you have two different organisms living together, this is called a symbiosis. So sym means living together or together, and this means life. So the plants and the bacteria actually have a mutualistic symbiosis. So you can have a parasitic symbiosis where it only benefits the parasite and not the host, but this is mutualistic symbiosis, so it benefits both. And there are a group of plants that are capable of nitrogen fixation, and they are in the group, the legumes. And so these include peas, lentils, peanuts, for example. Okay, and these would be, legumes are like beans, right? But beans. And so some farmers will sometimes plant cover crops of peas because that increases the amount of nitrogen that is available for a plant that does not have the ability to fix nitrogen, does not have the bacteria. So like around here, they plant cover crops of peas, that increases the nitrogen that's available for wheat, which is not a nitrogen fixing plant that has the bacteria. Okay, so the legumes are a special group. Okay, so we also have denitrifying bacteria because we have to think about, denitrifying. We have to think about how we could complete this cycle. So denitrifying bacteria, okay, they take the nitrogen and convert it back into nitrogen gas. Now there is another natural source of nitrogen, and this is kind of interesting. We have these nitrogen fixing bacteria, but we also have lightning. So the process of lightning coming through the atmosphere, that energy will convert nitrogen into a form that when it rains can then be used by plants. So if we look in your book, there is this diagram. So biological nitrogen fixation, that would be your bacteria. This lightning produces nitric oxides, which then can be brought to the atmosphere or brought down from the atmosphere and used. Notice how the nitrogen fixing bacteria can produce organisms, living plants that have proteins and nucleic acids that need nitrogen. So we have to have nitrogen in our body. And then we also have this returning. So this is denitrification, where the bacteria return it back to nitrogen oxides that then go back into the atmosphere. Okay, so if we look at our waste in animals, right? We get rid of nitrogenous waste through urine, right? So we can get nitrogen. This is when we urinate, we get rid of that nitrogenous waste. And if it goes into the soil, it could be used potentially by plants, can be converted to ammonia and used by plants for growth. So we animals, not only just plants, but animals are also part of that nitrogen cycle. So if we look at the nitrogen fixing plants, the legumes, this is a picture of their roots. And so these are called root nodules. And so they are little areas on the roots. And so you can always tell if something is a nitrogen fixing plant if you pull it up and it has these little knobs on the roots, then you know that this is a plant that is capable of nitrogen fixation. Okay, so if we look at the human influences in the nitrogen cycle, the big one is producing synthetic fertilizers. So this was a big deal back in the early 1900s when a group of, or two scientists actually, came up with a mechanism to take nitrogen from our atmosphere and using energy produce nitrogen fertilizer. And so this is what is called the Haber-Bosch, spell it over here, Haber-Bosch process. And this is named after the two scientists that eventually won the Nobel Prize. And so they take natural gas, and they use that energy in the natural gas to split atmospheric nitrogen and convert it to ammonia. So we have N2, right, converted into NH3 with the addition of energy from natural gas. Now, natural gas is a fossil fuel. So one of the problems with this synthetic fertilization is it does produce, burning of fossil fuels does produce carbon, right? So we release carbon into the atmosphere. But we now are taking, and we have lots more nitrogen on the planet than we normally would without this process. So like if you use Miracle-Gro, right, those would be examples of synthetic fertilizers. If you use compost tea, or if you use, sometimes they call them fish fertilizers, where they take fish and they kind of grind it up and they make us fishy, it's very fishy smelling. But you can put it on your garden instead of Miracle-Gro, which is a synthetic fertilizer. So that can cause a problem. And then one of the problems with this is that sometimes this nitrogen gets put back into the atmosphere and it can produce acid rain. And so that is another problem that we previously talked about, the production of acid rain by the release of nitric oxide into the atmosphere. Okay, so we also have sewage. And when we're talking about sewage, it can be human sewage, but it can also be from feedlots, for example. And this can sometimes get into the water. Even Portland, Oregon has a problem with that. If there is a lot of rain in a given period of time, the sewage pipes back up and then they get discharged into the rivers. And so the problem with this is this leads to over-fertilization of the water. And so this is what is called eutrophication. So let me write that better. Eutrophication. So eu means good, troph means feeding. So this literally means good feeding. But it is a bad thing because what happens with eutrophication, and you'll investigate this in your SymBio lab, the Simutex lab that you're going to be doing, is that it causes an algae bloom. And so you can see this in most rivers in the West, for example, in the summertime, they turn like a bright green. And that means that there's too much nutrients in the water, and then the algae bloom. Now the algae, interestingly, produces O2 when alive, okay? But upon death, the decomposition of that excess algae that's been produced uses up the oxygen in the water. So the amount of oxygen in the water that's available for organisms like fish and invertebrates to use decreases dramatically. And so it's the subsequent decomposition that uses up the oxygen in terms of respiration. So those microorganisms that are feeding upon the algae use oxygen and they release CO2. So this release of CO2 is called anoxic, or excuse me, not release of CO2, but the lack of oxygen. So an anoxic environment means that there is too little oxygen in water, for example. And so this can lead to the death of fish, for example, and then more decomposition until all the oxygen is used up. Now, sometimes water moves over rapids, and when it does, that helps to oxygenate the water. And sometimes it also is colder, and dissolved oxygen is higher in cold water. So if you're talking about a mountain stream, probably wouldn't have a lot of wastewater running into it anyway. But a mountain stream, a cold mountain stream, is going to have high oxygen concentrations. And then if you have a slow moving, hot, warm water, so the Umatilla River in the summertime, when you get this bloom, it's usually really warm. And that warmth also decreases the amount of dissolved oxygen that is present in the water. Okay. So that is the problem. One of the big problems with having excess nitrogen is eutrophication. Okay, so this just shows the amount of nitrogen that we captured. And so here you can see that it has increased kind of dramatically with the advent of chemical processes like the Haber-Bosch process that uses nitrogen. That also, interestingly, that process was developed during World War I. And the nitrogen was not just used for fertilizers, but it was also used for ammunition and bombs. And so this process of being able to get excess nitrogen and then use it in explosives was really pivotal in the World War I. Nitrogen can also be released and it can produce smog. And so we'll talk about this when we talk about air pollution, but the air pollution, one of the problems is the smog that is produced. And you've probably seen pictures of people having to wear masks. And so this could be like in the middle of the day in Beijing, where they have a real problem with air pollution. And then this just shows runoff from a feedlot that probably has lots of nitrogen in it from the cows' waste products, their feces and their urine. And if that gets into a stream, then it's going to cause eutrophication. Now, one of the problems with eutrophication and anoxic environments are what are called dead zones. And these can be found off the coast. Where rivers empty into the ocean. So a big example is the Mississippi River emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. So you can see, it's kind of small, but you can see all these little red zones right there. Those are dead zones. And so there's so much nutrients and so much waste products being run off and into the Gulf of Mexico that there's a giant dead zone, which means that there are no organisms that live in that particular area. So there's no fish, there's no invertebrates. And so it creates a havoc with coastal fisheries, those dead zones. Okay, so if we look at, here's just showing the Mississippi. And the interesting thing is that they used to use legumes and animal manure early on, but then notice in the 1960s and the 1970s, they developed and they started using more fertilizer. And that fertilizer actually allowed for much more agriculture, so a lot more agricultural products. But then we also see that you have these zones of low oxygen off the coast here that are the dead zones that are due to the excessive nitrogen that's being washed down the Mississippi River. Okay, so the last two we're going to go kind of quickly with the phosphorus and the sulfur. Phosphorus is very interesting because it does not have an atmospheric component. The amount of phosphorus in the atmosphere is very, very small. The phosphorus is generally taken from the Earth's crust. So there's only a small amount in the atmosphere. So I'll put that it's not stored in the atmosphere. And this is what makes it so much different than nitrogen, which makes up the vast majority of the atmosphere. So it's in the Earth's crust. That's where it's stored. So you have geological activity like uplift, where areas get pushed to the surface, and then you get erosion. And this releases the phosphorus so that it can be used by organisms. So that erosion releases it. And most phosphorus is converted into phosphate ions. So the phosphate ion is PO4 with a -3. Okay, so this is a phosphate ion. And phosphate ions are really important in DNA. And they're also found in ATP, which is our form of energy that animals and plants use. So phosphate ions are also found in proteins. So this phosphorus or the phosphate ions can end up in streams and be carried out to the ocean. So that's a flow. The interesting thing is it can also be returned to the freshwater by certain animals. So for example, salmon are a type of fish that return to the freshwater system like rivers. So I'll just put freshwater rivers. FW is just freshwater rivers. Return to the freshwater rivers and bring phosphorus with them. So where we get phosphorus is primarily through mining. Right? So we can mine areas of rock that have lots of phosphorus there. And in the past, it was also, we look at the human influences, there was also guano. So you could put guano, and guano is bird feces. And there's phosphorus in the bird feces. And so this area, this island, for example, has these huge colonies of seabirds. And so what people would do is they would go to that colony and they would mine guano. And so you could just put that guano is another source of phosphorus. And then here you can see this is the mining of the rock for the phosphorus. Okay, so if we go back to this phosphate cycle, so notice that in the atmosphere is really small percentage. Okay, in the soils there's more and mineable rock, right? And then we also use phosphorus as fertilizer. So nitrogen and phosphorus are common fertilizers that we use. And then phosphorus can go into the ocean where it can actually be buried in sediments. The other thing the only last thing I wanted to say about the phosphorus is that sometimes phosphorus can travel in winds. And so this shows, for example, the burning, actually I think this is a drought, sorry. This is the drought in Africa. And what we see is that the soil dries out and then the winds come in and they actually blow the eroded soil over to Africa. and excuse me, not over from Africa to South America. And so what we see, oops, it's going the wrong way, sorry. So what we see is that phosphorus can be carried in the winds, and it forms a significant contribution to South America. So here it just shows, and this is a diagram from your book that shows the movement of phosphorus from Africa to South America. Okay, so that's phosphorus. So the last element that we're going to talk about is sulfur. So sulfur is necessary for proteins, and it is very abundant, and it is not usually a limiting resource. So I'll just put not usually a limiting resource like phosphorus and nitrogen. Sulfur is in the Earth's crust, just like phosphorus, and it combines with iron to make fool's gold. And fool's gold is pyrite. And it has the molecular formula Fe, that's the iron, and then the sulfur is S2, and this is fool's gold. So sometimes when you go to places where they're mining it, you can get a little bit of this in like a little glass container, okay? And then weathering of that will release sulfur into the environment. There's another form of sulfur, and that is in the form of gypsum. So gypsum is a source of sulfur, and it is also mined, and it is calcium, calcium Ca sulfate. And so that is another source of sulfur. When we look at the problems with sulfur, is oftentimes we find sulfur in mine tailings. So like when they're mining copper or they're mining gold, these usually have a high concentration of pyrite. And then the mine tailings are also acidic. So when you take the sulfates and you combine them with water, what you get is sulfuric acid. And this is what is referred to as acid mine drainage. So you might be familiar with this because recently in Colorado, a few years ago, there was a huge spill, and I think it was from a gold mine, and it wreaked havoc in the San Juan River. And you can see here, this would be mine tailings. If this is very acidic, what it's going to do is it's going to kill all the organisms in that particular body of water. And what happens is sometimes they put these in holding ponds, and then the holding ponds fail, and then we get this water, this very acidic water, ending up in rivers. And so this is an image of a river. I think this is the near, maybe leading into the San Juan River in Colorado. And so the EPA is responsible for going in there and cleaning this up. And so what they want to do is that they want to reduce the acidity, and then the heavy metals will come out of solution. And so you can get the water that is this orange color that is cloudy, turning back into clear running water. And so this is a huge issue with mining, and it is a problem, obviously, that requires environmental scientists to help solve the best way to clean up and to also prevent such accidents from happening. Okay, so that is all the information that you need for your studying of the biogeochemical cycles.